Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have back with us Dave Petersen. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We are looking at the Gospel reading for the first Sunday after Epiphany. It comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52. I'll read that in the English Standard Version. Now, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Okay, so this is the first Sunday after Epiphany. What's the theme of Epiphany altogether, this part of the liturgical year?
God is manifest in the man, Jesus Christ.
Okay. So Epiphany begins with the journey of the Magi, and then this is that first Sunday after Epiphany. How is God manifested in the person and work of Jesus Christ here? Because it seems like there are two things that point to it. One is that he's in his father's temple, or he's in his father's house, among his father's things, I guess you would say. And then secondly, you get this statement at the end that he went with them and was submissive to them, and then grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Like, what's the relation between him being among his father's things in the temple and then it being stated that he was submissive to his father and mother and went with them back to Nazareth and then grew in wisdom and stature? And how does that reveal God in the flesh?
It's showing, in some ways, it's a showing of his humanity, right? Because there's actually change that he can grow. And in this sense, it's actually a self-revelation as much as it is a revelation to the teachers of the law and to Mary and to Joseph, that Jesus himself is becoming more conscious of his Father's mission, right?
Okay.
And so I think that is, one of the sort of key realities here is that, which is just almost impossible to fathom, but when he was a baby in the manger, how aware is he of his mission?
Right.
And I mean, it's not that he's opposed to it, of course, or that he's utterly ignorant of it. I don't think we'd want to say that, but he's not really conscious of it. And there is this sense in which now he realizes to whom he belongs and what his purpose is. And I mean, it's important, I think, therefore, it's so pointed that, why did they go to Jerusalem? For the Passover. Mm-hmm. And, what's going on at the temple. And, we don't know what these teachers are talking about, but it seems like they're probably talking about the Passover. And so this is what, causes him. Yeah.
Is there a sense in which we can talk about Jesus growing in wisdom and stature, and even submission to his earthly parents, where God is made manifest in seemingly mundane, everyday things. In other words, when we typically think of the epiphanies of the Lord, right, we think of strange and manifestly glorious things, the burning bush, or powerful things like the pillar of cloud and fire and the plagues that attended it. We think of the Mount of Transfiguration. But here, it seems as though what Luke is pointing out and what the fathers have given us in terms of the lectionary, that it's not always going to be kind of like these mountaintop things, but rather it's going to be demonstrated in everyday, ordinary things, like his submission to his earthly parents, him growing in wisdom and stature, that he gains skills in the same way that everyone does, through discipline and work.
Right. And he's also on the cusp of manhood. And so, so I think before his submission or subordination to his parents, it probably wasn't completely conscious. 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds don't think about obeying their mothers and their fathers in a real conscious way, the way that a 15-year-old does. When the 15-year-old boy is, 7 inches taller than his father and weighs 100 more pounds, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, he thinks about what, he's aware, and there's some tension there. Mm-hmm. And so imagine the tension in Jesus, who is God himself and chooses, in this act of obedience to the fourth commandment and to his heavenly Father in order to fulfill this mission. So it is an act of power. Yeah. It is a miracle of the incarnation. But of course, to the eyes of the world, it's not as impressive as walking on water or multiplying loaves. Right. But in terms of the atonement, it's actually more significant, right?
And actually more impressive. We know how difficult it is to restrain when you know that you have the power to do something to the contrary. That's what I find remarkable about this is
exactly. And that they're not really worthy of it. They've just failed. He doesn't chafe under the authority of his parents, his earthly parents, but he submits to it.
Well, Steckhart makes a big deal of that point, doesn't he? Where he says how easy it is to lose the child Jesus, how easy it is to be caught up with other things and lose sight of him. That's really what his sermon's devoted to, which is a take that I haven't really considered in terms of putting yourself in the position of Mary and Joseph and considering how easy it is for us to lose sight of Jesus, and yet Jesus never loses sight of where he belongs and what his mission is.
Right. Well, Jesus he's easily taken for granted. He's easily abused. And, I think that's, Mary never has to tell Jesus to do something twice. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how many times Lauren has to tell your boys to do stuff, but I'm guessing more than once most of the time. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, and probably has to tell you to do things more than once. So, I mean, think about the kind of perfect obedience that and the other thing with Jesus is he doesn't ever ignore things he should be doing. Right. So a lot of times you should be doing something, but you just don't want to. And so you need the authority to tell you, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus anticipates the needs of others. He's perfect. He's so obedient. He's so concerned about other people. So, Mary doesn't need to tell him to be in the right place at the right time. We're leaving tomorrow. He knows, he's attentive. And so that actually has made her, that's made her lazy.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there is a lesson for that in us too, that, right, to not presume upon grace, because Jesus is so generous, so kind, that we're like, big deal. I can get away with this. He won't mind. But we're, playing with fire.
Yeah, the squeaky wheel gets the grease mentality type thing, right?
Yeah. So, I think Mary and Joseph fail, in my estimation. They neglect their child. He is still a child at 12, and they should be paying attention. They went a whole day without notice. That's a long time to not look around and wonder where your kid is. It
depends how normal that was.
It still seems to be a pretty long time.
Yeah, in our day, it would be extremely abnormal.
I think it's a lot. I would expect, she's not, I wonder where he's eating breakfast. I wonder where he's eating lunch. I wonder where he's eating dinner. Just this whole time, it seems a very long time to me, even in the ancient world. Maybe, there's dangers in the ancient world too, even though, they're traveling with these companions. It seems a lot to me. In any case, I think they failed. And I think it gets worse because, she accuses him of causing them pain.
Yeah.
Right. She blames them. Why have you done this to us? As though he's done something untoward, as though he's failed. And so I think that's guilt. That's a defensive mechanism on her part.
Yeah.
And again, he's kind.
This is always, it actually brings up the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that this is always the possibility when you're dealing with custom, things that you're accustomed to and to doing and happening that you, as you said, take them for granted. So what does this text teach us about custom, the good and the bad and the ugly?
Yeah, well, the good is it's a helpful structure, and helps us predict the future and know what to expect in some sense. But you still have to pay attention to the details.
Yeah,
and you still have to. You can't. You have a responsibility. I just had a failure just last week. I'm so mad at myself for this. So this is a busy time for an Advent service every day, preaching every day. And so I'd written my sermon for the next day. I'd printed it out. I'd set the altar, had set the missal stand. Everything was ready. In the morning, I went in there, made sure that the altar guild had gotten their stuff. It's fairly early in the morning, glanced up at the pulpit, the sermon's there, everything's ready. And then I forget about it, go do the service, walk in, step into the pulpit. Well, it was yesterday's sermon was there. I printed the sermon, but it was still in the printer. And so now it's too late. What are you going to do? Right. There's no time. I'm standing there, I realize this. And now, the Lord provides and he's merciful. And I knew enough things. I could say something. It worked out okay in a way. And some people thought it was great, to tell you the truth. And I think they were sincere. But I was not happy at all with myself because that was a leadership failure, right? I did not pay attention to details. I was lazy. I assumed I'd done something out of habit, out of custom, but I didn't actually inspect or check. And, that happens. I'm not losing sleep over it. Don't mishear me. I'm not going to probably confess this at my next confession. I don't think it's the worst thing I've ever done, but at the same time, it was a failure. And I regret it, and I don't want it to ever happen again. And the only way to not let it not happen again is to not be lazy and to do the work and to pay it, right? So, that's the kind of thing that happens to us when we're lazy, inattentive.
Yeah.
And it's not always a disaster, but it's irreverent. That was right. I wasn't ready. I didn't check everything. And so, I think that, why didn't I? In some ways, the reason I hadn't was because I've been doing this every single day. And so that creates a kind of complacency. And it seemed like I'd done it. Does that make sense? I think that's the danger of custom, right? You just start to assume things. And, it's not that that those habits aren't healthy, but the flesh is weak. And anytime it can take a shortcut, it wants a shortcut.
Yeah, that's right. So did you happen to look at Well, I mean, this is all of us. This happens to me.
I know.
With
I know.
So usually I mark the next reading that Sunday,
Right.
and every once in a while I just don't. You just get caught up in whatever's
Exactly.
going on with church. You get distracted, and you don't do what you're usually doing. And so then, since it was my custom to always do that, I think I've already done it. And then I get there
Exactly.
the next time I hadn't checked. But now it's like you double and triple check things. The same thing has happened to me with regard to the proper preface. Like I always mark that on a particular day. And for whatever reason, sometimes I guess I don't do it. I don't know if it's because of busyness or laziness or a combination of both. But I, get up to the altar and I'm like, oh, well, this is still in Advent. This is not Christmas. Luckily, it's only a page over, right? But it does throw you off from the flow of what you're expecting.
Well, and if you weren't prepared at all, it would be worse. Right.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the good news is, the habits and the so forth, where it is, how to respond. It's not that you've utterly neglected it, but,
right.
It's not like your preparation was completely worthless, but you did miss a step. And that's why we need, checklists. I need checklists. I need things written down. And I liked what you said, double and triple check, right? If you're going to approach the service with reverence requires preparation. Right. So to walk in unprepared is and preparation, even though it's imperfect, helps you respond to emergencies or mistakes or, a change in the enemy's what's that line about no plan ever survives contact with the enemy? Something like that.
Yeah, something to that effect. Yeah.
And I mean, not that we're engaged in that level of activities in a sense, but if you don't have a plan, then you don't have any ability to react because, you're in a panic. So anyway, that's the problem with customs. That isn't to say that we don't need them. Again, it's like, sometimes you'll hear somebody say, well, no plan survives contact with the enemy, therefore let's not have a plan. Wrong. That's going to be a disaster. You need to have a plan so that you can have contingencies so that you can adapt if you haven't even thought about it. So you've made a mistake. You didn't mark the right preface, but at least you know where the prefaces are and you recognize the error and you're able to adapt more quickly. If all of a sudden you found out you had to have a preface, that'd be terrible. And it would be distracting, and I get it. Okay, prefaces are adiaphora. God doesn't care. Blah blah blah. I think God does care because not that He necessarily cares exactly about the preface, but He doesn't want you to be inserting yourself and distracting people from His word.
Right.
And He wants you to model, the calm, confident presence that we are to have in the gospel and the orderliness of things and to have real content, So anyway, that's the problem with not having a sermon. I mean, at least I had a sermon written, so I knew something, even though I didn't have it in front of me. If you have the preface, I mean, you're able to adjust. You could probably make up a preface on the spot.
Yeah. Well, you could probably just do the common one.
Do the common one. You could say you. So the advantage, you are required to actually have content, and while the exact wording of the content might be adiaphora, you are required to have content. So all of that. I know we poo-poo that stuff. I hate that. It all matters. We should pay attention to it, not in a legalistic way, but again, as an act of reverence and excellence, that wanting to actually put forth the word of God with clarity and with power and relevancy, not just cuteness or for the sake of popularity, and the like, which is always sort of the temptation.
Yeah, just because it's not required doesn't mean that it's doesn't matter.
Right. Or that anything goes.
Yes.
Right. Right. Okay.
So who did you look at this week? Did you got some more Edersheim or?
I do. I'm having a reawakening or a rediscovery of Edersheim. So this is from the Life and Times of the Messiah. And he has a very long section on this. Starts on page 248. Well, it really starts on page 235, where he talks about the temple. In fact, so what's it like to go to the temple for your first time as a 12-year-old boy? And he writes just beautifully about this. He says the way that the kind of way this would have felt to coming to the temple, probably for the first time now as a man, the way that Jesus is coming after his 12th birthday. Let us go into the house of the Lord. He writes, they were not ruins to which precious memories clung, nor did the great hope seem to lie afar off behind the evening mist. But glorious things were spoken of Zion, the city of God, in the past and in the near future. The thrones of David were to be set within her walls and amidst her palaces. And he talks about the awareness of kings and prophets, standing in those same places. And then he goes into this very long thing about the political realities of Jerusalem at this time. And he makes a kind of a side note, but he spends several pages that he really wants to divide the political parties of Israel at this time into just two parties. Which surprised me. And basically, you're either a nationalist, which would be like a zealot that wants to, like the Maccabees, wanting to kind of restore that, or you're, a kind of, what's the word, collaborator with Rome, or a Hellenist kind of thing. And the Pharisees are not nationalists. So the way that they collaborate with Rome is by kind of, in some ways, giving up the temple and instituting synagogues and abstracting their religion to sort of philosophy rather than action, which that discussion was fascinating to think in those terms and how dangerous that is and how easily I think we could succumb to that kind of thing where we make Christianity an intellectual pursuit that, is all philosophical and abstract.
Kind of happening in 2020, not to go back to that, but that how willingly we were just to say it's all about the word, and that's not wrong, right? It's a true statement, but abstracted from how the word takes root in the things that the word actually commands us to do.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of it in terms of, just a kind of ongoing frustration, in just so many aspects of my life. I have, people will show up at my congregation, and I'm sure we've all experienced this, and, they're not Lutheran. And I'll say, well, we're Lutheran. So, we believe Lutheran communion for Lutherans or whatever. And they'll say, oh yeah, that's fine with me because, in my heart, I'm a Lutheran. Or I was confirmed here, and I never stopped believing. I believe exactly what I believed then. And well, why are you going to the Methodist church? Oh, well, I still believe. No, you don't. Right. I mean, so there is this idea they think and anything I say to them theologically, they agree with anything. So, I know full well that the Methodist church does not teach that our Lord, the risen Jesus, is bodily present in bread and wine for Christians to eat and drink for the forgiveness of their sins. That is not the Methodist teaching. Right. But they will swear up and down, and I will try to put it kind of, get right to the edge of Capernetic eating to offend them. And, it doesn't matter. I can't offend them. They totally think anything I say, oh yeah, I agree with that. Because to them, it's just an absolute abstraction. And so that's what I think. They just kind of abstract or spiritualize theology in such a way that, the fact that God is Trinity has no actual impact on how they worship him, right? The fact that Jesus is bodily present in the sacrament has no, relevance to how they worship or to how they live their lives. The fact that Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven doesn't impact them or how they look at their unbelieving family, right? I mean, on and on and on it goes. And I find this discussions within the Missouri Synod, about the divisions within the Missouri Synod are very difficult to diagnose or to discuss because, for example, when I talk to clergymen, they say they agree with me doctrinally. They subscribe to the Book of Concord. And I'm not, disputing that they're sincere in this, but then it's like, well, why then do you do the things that you do? Like, why doesn't your worship reflect the Book of Concord? Why doesn't the Book of Concord describe you? Right? I mean, that kind of question. And, so it's like, they're like, no, we agree. We agree on the content. We just don't agree on the how. And I'm like, what? The how doesn't come out of nothing, right? There's some things that are out of line. And I'm admittedly, I don't want to give the idea that there's only one way of doing things or that everything has to be done exactly the same and ceremonies must be the same everywhere. I don't think that at all. And I don't even think that'd be a very fun place to live. But there are limits, right? So there is this kind of, I think that's what the Pharisees are. I never thought of it that way before, but they've until, reading this Edersheim. But right, they sort of just want to talk about doctrine, but then it doesn't actually, in a sense, impact the world because we can live with we can live under the Roman government just fine. And of course, the other extreme are hardly better, though I think in some ways they're more appealing. The zealots, the nationalists, they only care about that, right? The only thing they care about is getting rid of Rome and having their own king, and they don't actually care about doctrine and love, and so it's an interesting dynamic, and I think he's onto something, and I think there's ways that we could see ourselves falling at various times on one side or the other, of that, right? Dead orthodoxy, or the kind of purity cult that the Gottesdienst crowd is prone to, is also a kind of version of that Pharisaical stuff, where we only care about doctrine and abstract. We don't actually care about people. That would be, that's not biblical, right?
Right.
So I'm not trying to paint any particular group within the Missouri Synod into this. I found it a very interesting way of thinking about the world and seeing it kind of in the ministry of Jesus in a way that might help us diagnose our own problems a little bit and repent and do better.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have a lot to do with this reading, but that's where he talks about it. Okay. Enough of that?
Yes, please.
Okay. I guess that's enough of that. Yes, please. Well, Jonathan can cut it out if he hates it. Okay, so
it was fine. It is a good thing to think about. I'm not sure what it would do for this text, at least.
Yeah, I know. He just goes into it because he wants to set up. I mean, that's what Edersheim's very good at. He knows all this history, geography. So he's talking about all the history of the high priests. Who's high priest at the time when Jesus comes to the temple? It's Annas, by the way. All right, so now finally to the text, what happens and ways that we might think about this and contemplate this. I would focus on two verses from this text. Verse 46, where Jesus is listening and asking, and it is that listening and asking is causing astonishment in those who are in the teachers and everyone who observes it, right? And then also they are amazed at his understanding and his answers. So listening, asking, answering, and understanding is causing this amazement because he has this insight that is surprising. Now, we're not told, again, I think as a good guess, they're talking about the Passover. They're teaching about the Passover, and he's responding to it in a way that is remarkable. Precocious probably as well, but I think more than precocious, it's prophetic. He's probably helping them see and understand what the temple's for, what the business of the temple is, what the Passover's for, and how it's going to be fulfilled. And I think also, as already said, seeing himself in it and his role more clearly than before and realizing he's the Passover lamb, he's the stuff of his temple. And I'm sure we talked about this last time, how you translate this. The New King James has father's business. I think the ESV had father's house. It's more literally kind of translated among his Father's things. And I don't think business is bad. I don't think house is bad. I mean, it's kind of an awkward way to speak in English, but I sort of wish it was just translated among my Father's things, because I like the idea of Jesus being one of his Father's things in the temple for the purpose of fulfilling the temple's mission, right? And, that whole thing. So anyway, that whole, kind of astonishment and coming to awareness, awakening in a sense to who he is, and others as well being awakened to this. And then in relation to this, also the other verses, verse 52, this whole idea that he actually grows in wisdom and in maturity and in favor with God and with men. And those are, three of those things are mysterious, right? How can God grow in wisdom or maturity or in favor with himself? Okay, with men, sure. But, how can there be that sort of change? But there is. So now a couple other things here. Now going back to Edersheim here. So we got that kind of backdrop. That's the textual reality. Some of how we might deal with this, I think we find some help in Edersheim. By the way, this is the first time it is recorded that Jesus is speaking, though what he says isn't recorded. So just their response to it. First of all, Jesus is entirely, how could this happen, and Mary go through this? In the first place, Jesus is completely absorbed in being in his Father's house, or being about his Father's business, or with the Passover, right? And not in a selfish way, not like he's having so much fun that he forgets to eat, right? That's happened to us, but not in this kind of way, where this is selfless, that he's completely aware of who he is, and in some sense forgets everything else. Next, of course, there is this kind of deep realization that this is his Father's house and his Father's purpose in the world. And, whether or not this is the foundation of the world, the way the first place, the Garden of Eden, it is the temple is the absolute center of the world and God's interaction with man. And then this was really brilliant of Edersheim. He says, I wonder if Mary on the way there, told him the story of Simeon and Anna. And I don't know why I never thought about that before, but I mean, that makes total sense. Whether he did it, whether Mary told him then, certainly by 12 years. I mean, come on. She had to have told him about the angel Gabriel, about the shepherds coming, right? About the Magi coming, about going to the temple and Simeon making this prophecy, right? And, I don't know how much they hung out with, Aunt Elizabeth, but, there's some stories there too. And, how that might inform, again, kind of his awareness of what he's doing there. And then finally, so the absorption, or the sort of being lost to the world, the realization of the temple as the center of God's interaction with man, and then finally the real setting of his will and setting of his own will and desire to fulfill his Father's will. And then Edersheim quotes this passage from the Samaritan woman, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. And I think that's just beautiful. And as an application of all of that, and this is again out of Edersheim, who's a Calvinist, but I'm going to take it a little further than he does. He says, this is the way that we ought to respond to the Lord's Supper. Now, isn't that an insight, right? So if the temple was the center of God's interaction with man, now the center of God's interaction with man is the Lord's Supper. And we ought to respond to the Lord's Supper the way that Jesus responded, with this loss to the world, right? Forgetting all other things, being entirely absorbed with it, with this realization of what the supper is doing to us, with this memory of the Passover and and Maundy Thursday, the crucifixion, the resurrection, Emmaus, and then this desire to actually do the Father's will. There's a sermon there, I think.
Yeah. So Luke records that it was their custom every year to go. What's different about this year than previous years? Why Jesus is in the temple asking these questions this year and not previous years? And what makes this year distinct?
So Edersheim says that this command that they're to go to the temple every year is for the men. So the women didn't have to go, and the boys wouldn't have gone, or might not have gone. They could have gone. So what makes it different for Edersheim is he thinks this is the first time Jesus has gone himself. It's the custom of the family to go, but it wouldn't have been that. That's what's different. I mean, but I don't know. I mean, I don't think the Bible requires us to read it that way, but I'm just telling you what he said.
I know that is the case in the Old Testament, but I mean, verse 41, now his parents
I know.
went to Jerusalem every year.
Right. But it doesn't mean necessarily that he went with them. So his parents went every year. So apparently Hillel, he talks a lot about Hillel. He doesn't like these rabbis. I love that about him. Hillel says the women should go too. So that he brought that up explicitly. So his parents went every year, but he maybe didn't go.
Okay.
I don't know. The teaching thing is also a little bit ambiguous. Why exactly there's teachers teaching there and what they're teaching and what might be. There's different sort of theories. Though Edersheim thinks it's probably just not that big a deal. It's not like this is so some people have suggested that this is actually like a rabbi school. And so Jesus is sort of inappropriately there. I mean, in that he's only 12 and he doesn't have any formal training and that sort of thing. And he's, like you show up to law school and start answering all the questions. But Edersheim doesn't think that's the case. There's a couple other possibilities. But Edersheim thinks this is just typical. They just come out and they just teach, and they probably teach on the Passover and the stuff about the temple. And it's probably kind of Sunday school level stuff. And it's not inappropriate for people to ask questions and to engage, and even for somebody as young as Jesus. So that's kind of what Edersheim takes it as. But I mean, that's the other thing that seems to be different. If Jesus had been there before, it doesn't seem that they'd ever engaged in these teachers.
Okay.
So it's interesting. So he has a nice bit on why is Mary surprised, which I found very helpful. This is on page 250. So, she should know all this, right? I mean, she has all the Old Testament and so forth. And then, of course, the stuff that happened to her. But so here's how he says this. He writes, the Virgin Mother's seeming ignorance of her son's true character is probably caused by these things. First of all, the necessary gradualness of such a revelation. Now, that's all he says, but I want to just think about that for a second. I think that's a brilliant insight that, Jesus is growing, well, so is Mary, right? So are we all. And so also the history of Israel was a gradual revelation, right? It didn't all come through. That this is kind of the character. And I know I've said this on here before, but I often think about my own experience with people being converted to Christianity, that I've never seen one of these road to Damascus conversions. They're always gradual. And I think this is the kind of more typical way that God operates. And so, Mary, again, has kind of become accustomed to Jesus. It's not that she's being impious, but, it's kind of slowly being revealed. And that's kind of the way of God. Next, the necessary development of his own consciousness, right? That Jesus himself is growing as a human over time in his understanding of his mission and purpose. And then finally, he says the fact that Jesus could not have been subject to his parents, nor had true and proper human training if they had clearly known that he was the essential Son of God. So I like that last one the least, but but I wonder if we could paraphrase that, what Edersheim's after, by saying, could Mary and Joseph have really handled it if they had understood what they were getting into? And probably not. And probably most things in this life right? I mean, people always talk about this. Would you get married if you actually knew how difficult it would be? Would you have children? Would you go into the office of the ministry? Would you join the army? Right? We do a lot of things, and then we have a vocation, and now we have to fulfill it. And in some sense, we didn't know what we were getting into, and maybe that's what he means. And then he's got this great paragraph, which I want to read you. Do you got something to say?
No, but I mean, thinking
you.
about all that, I mean, yeah, I'd get married. I'd have more kids.
I know. I agree. And I think
all of those
course,
things.
In a sense. But there is this sort of, you couldn't have been told everything, right? Or understood it when you began.
No.
It had, and I think that's the way I want to understand what Edersheim said.
Gotcha.
Right? That if they they didn't really quite know what they were getting into. And I don't mean that they would have said, no, I won't do it. I mean, Mary beautifully said, I'm the handmaiden of the Lord. I mean, it's like my favorite thing ever. And let it be unto me according to your word. So I don't want to take any of that away from her. But at the same time, she just couldn't have handled it or understood it. She has to experience it. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Yeah. He writes, now we finally, then this whole idea of his subordination and going back to Nazareth. He writes, a further, though to us it seems a downward step, was his quiet, immediate, unquestioning return to Nazareth with his parents and his willing submission to them while there. It was self-denial, self-sacrifice, self-consecration to his mission with all that it implied. It was not self-exonition, it's a weird word, but self-submission, all the more glorious in proportion to the greatness of that self. Self-exonation, I don't know how to pronounce that, means like self-emptying. Mm-hmm. So he was not emptying himself of his divine powers, right? But he's humbling himself. And it's all the more glorious, right? I love this. It's self-denial, self-sacrifice, self-consecration to his mission that he submits to Mary and Joseph. And then he writes, this constant contrast before her eyes only deepened in the heart of Mary the ever-present impression of all those matters of which she was the most cognizant. She was learning to spell out the word Messiah, as each of those matters taught her one fresh letter in it, and she looked at them all in the light of the Nazareth sun. S-U-N. He's great.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I got from Edersheim. There's more, but that's enough to whet your appetite.
Yeah.
I think...
does he talk at all about... I mean, he does in other books. I think his book on the temple, he talks about just the vast quantities of sacrifices that are happening and just how much blood is being poured out. Does he bring that up at all in terms of this is what Jesus is experiencing if this is his first time as a 12-year-old?
Yeah.
And becoming self-conscious, like this is, if I'm this lamb.
Yeah.
Is that what the conversation is about? Does he talk about that?
Yeah, he does at great length. He also says that the temple holds 210,000 people. I mean, so he goes to great length explaining, how many steps you go up and what passages you pass through and what gates. And, but then he's got some great lines here. Okay, where is this? I have some of this where he talks about the temple. It's so impressive, and amazing. And yet Jesus' response is actually to the greater reality. And later, I can't find the quote. He's like, later when they will try to, kind of invoke this against Jesus, it actually makes him sad, right? That the greatness of this temple is actually a distraction in some ways for the majority of the people. So yeah, he does. He's really he talks so beautifully about the temple. 210,000 people.
Yeah. So is there a sense in what Edersheim is talking about, and even within Luke's gospel or the gospels in general, when we translate it Father's house, it's not bad, but that is how the people of his day would have thought about it. We've got to go to the house for God's name. right?
Right.
And they would have thought about it in terms of the building. But Luke definitely puts it about the actions there. The be among my father's things, which obviously
Well,
includes the house, but all the things and the stuff that's happening in the house in particular.
right.
Is there something that we should draw attention to where Luke is showing or demonstrating, or the Gospels are demonstrating, that all the things that were going on with regard to the prophecies of Jeremiah and Isaiah, treating the Father's house as though it were a cave for robbers to hide as their den, that they're still treating this just as a building, and not about the stuff that is going on in the building and what the purpose of those things are. And that's what is astonishing and amazing to the people.
Right, maybe. Well, and so it is a huge party, right? And he brings up, I mean, like as you said, like how much food is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's 210,000 people, and there's plenty of food for them because of the great number of sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an absolute festive, exciting, kind of glorious time, like going to a giant concert or something, and it's meant to be that, right? But the problem is that there's a lot of appeals to the flesh in there that can go awry quickly.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I mean, what Jesus sees is how these things go together. The fact that the Passover lamb is being killed for the sins of the people to protect us from the angel of death, and that's a horrific event. And yet at the same time, it's a feast, and we have this food, and we're with our friends, and there's beautiful music. And so, I mean, I think it does correspond in, it feels like to me a little bit like Good Friday. Our observances of Good Friday is not the actual Good Friday, but I mean, the way that, like, it's hilarious that the biggest day of the year, musically, our biggest day is Good Friday, not Easter. And all the great ceremonies and so forth are really Good Friday, even though it's horrific in a way. But I think that's part of what we love about it. But it's horrific, but we also love it, right? We sing the praise of him. You've got that kind of dual thing going. And I think so. You got kind of like that's what it should be. Most ideally. And I think that's what the Passover in the temple should be. But then you've got the sort of Christmas, like again, in our kind of correspondence, in our celebrations, it's like, think about how we celebrate Christmas. And it's great that it's a great party and that it's joyful and exciting and children laughing and presents and rich foods. But, you can focus on the wrong things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, what Jesus is seeing and what Luke is explaining, right, again, is this, here's the place where God meets man. And all of this is supposed to be of a singular character and mission. Yeah. And it's not like we just, think of, everybody's favorite, movie prayer is Talladega Nights and the prayer to the baby Jesus, which is hilarious, but absolutely, part of why it's hilarious is because it's actually so blasphemous. I like the baby Jesus, he says, right? You don't get to like the baby Jesus. That's just not how it works. And, it's so outrageous to try to pull this out of context. So I think that is part of the critique that, and maybe even Mary and Joseph had lost sight of that a little bit. Right. Look what you did to us. And hey, why are you surprised? Where else would I be? Don't you know what this is all about? Did you think this was a party just for the sake of having a party? Did you think this was a time for you to just, have a good old time with your sister while the children are, setting the garage on fire or whatever? Was that a little too autobiographical? Anyway, I have vivid memories of being neglected by my mother when she was with her sisters at Christmas time. They had such a great time when they were together, We weren't really neglected, but we did get into trouble. And, because sometimes, they were busy having a great time, and, off the cousins went for mischief.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we might be living that this week.
It's fun. It is a funny dynamic. I mean, I'm not, chastising my mother and her sisters. I mean, a little bit maybe, but it is a kind of complicated dynamic to navigate, isn't it? And they're joyful memories, but
yeah, there is a difficult, row to hoe, I suppose you'd say, is like how much is too much attention and how much is too little.
Right.
Particularly with children, like, in our day, we tend to neglect them by overemphasizing activities in a particular way, right?
Yeah.
It still ends up being neglect. It's not actually being with them. But
right.
at some point, it's you have to learn to play on your own, right? I'm not going to come up with every game for you.
Absolutely. And and boredom is good for us.
Right.
But it can be a way to get in trouble too.
Yes, it can be.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's a great account. It is a huge event. Again, I think, it is a more significant Christological event than, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say than the wedding at Cana, but probably the rest of the miracles that come up in Epiphany. The wedding at Cana has its own special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about why would you observe the baptism instead of this, or this instead of the baptism of our Lord?
Oh, yeah. Well, I like to do the old thing, and we do the baptism on the octave of Epiphany. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have a weekday service, of course, that then that makes it kind of tough. I think this is a very important account. Not that the baptism of Jesus isn't. I just like the traditional rendering. You've got the other thing, of course, is the visit of the Magi. Mm-hmm. Those are all mixed together kind of liturgically. The visit of the Magi, the baptism, and maybe it's just those two. But then, right, when do you get this one in? If you replace it with the baptism, yeah, I don't know. Why would you do it? It's a huge event, also, and certainly important. And again, probably more important than Jesus healing lepers or walking on water or even calming the storm. Not that anything Jesus does is insignificant, but
right.
Yeah, that's I like the older way of doing it and having the baptism on the octave, but it does require people to come to church on a weekday, which is tough. I think sometimes Contra Roining, the organist here, he really wants to do the baptism on a Sunday, and I have some years caved in and we've done it.
Yeah.
When it wasn't the actual octave, we've still done it. But I don't like doing it. I want to do this.
Yeah.
What do you do? Do you do baptism sometimes? Even if it's not
every other year.
13th. Oh, every other year. Okay.
I switch on and off. Early on, before we had communion every Sunday, since it was a feast day, we did it every year. But because we always had communion on feast days. So,
gotcha.
But then, once we had communion every Sunday, it was kind of like, I think we need this text. Like, we need to work this in somehow.
Right.
And yeah, so, we have a daily Matin service, Monday through Thursday, but it's not bringing in the texts for the assigned masses. So,
well, make one of those when the 13th falls on a Monday through a Thursday, make it a mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could do that. Yeah,
you probably still won't. You won't get very many people there probably, but at least it's being done. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
if it's on a Sunday, if the 13th's on a Sunday, then I would definitely do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think then you would miss this Sunday sometimes because, I can't remember how that works. because you always get the wedding at Cana, right? And then you always get the wedding at Cana, and you always get transfiguration, no matter how short Epiphany is. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what the rubric is. Seems like there's. Well, I'm pretty sure. I can't remember how that works. I should know that, but I've just forgotten.
Yeah.
I think you'd miss this one.
Mm-hmm.
But
you would. The baptism
would replace this.
Replaces this.
Okay, and then you go to Cana, and then whatever's after that. Mm-hmm. Well, I wouldn't mind that once in a while, but this is a big text.
It is. Any final thoughts? Anything we didn't cover?
No, I think that was pretty good.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, we'll pick up next time we're going to jump to Epiphany 3. We have probably 4 years of Epiphany 2. So we're going to jump to Epiphany 3 and take a look at that.
All right. Thanks, Jason.